Hey guys, it's Anna from Bright Lane Gardens, and today we're tackling one of the most common questions that I get at the nursery, which is which native plants are truly deer resistant? Stay tuned and we'll talk about the definition of what deer resistant means, if there's any plants that are deer proof, and which native plants will thrive even with heavy deer traffic like we have here on our own property. Now here's the truth. Very few plants are truly deer resistant, and even fewer are actually deer proof. Now deer resistant just means that deer will typically leave a certain plant alone as long as circumstances are usual. In my yard, we have really heavy deer traffic because this property is almost completely surrounded by the woods. They were here first. We usually let them be, but we do try to plant around what their preferences are. And their preferences, I've learned, change during certain seasons or in certain locations. So today we'll walk around the yard and talk about different plants that they've truly avoided, different plants that they've eaten based on opportunity because of timing or location, and we'll talk about those very few plants that are actually deer proof. First things first, let's talk about deer resistant versus deer proof. Deer proof means that the deer will literally never touch this plant. They won't eat it under any circumstances. And as you can imagine, very few plants fall into this category. But there is one special mention that we have here on our property that I'll bring up later in the video, truly a deer proof plant. Now, deer resistant, on the other hand, means that under normal circumstances, a deer won't usually touch that plant due to a strong fragrance, a bitter taste, or fuzzy or textured leaves. So there are certain qualities that are unattractive to a lot of deer, and they'll naturally avoid them in the wild. However, a hungry deer will truly eat anything. That's why we always mention that deer resistant plants are only deer resistant until they meet the right deer. So let's talk about the different factors that affect deer browsing in different situations. As I mentioned earlier, a deer resistant plant means that a deer will typically avoid eating that plant in normal circumstances. So let's talk about those circumstances or those factors that impact whether or not a deer will eat a plant. The first factor is location. Deer really like to feel safe. They're obviously easily scared. So if you have plants that are tucked away along a wood line or in a flower garden that's way off in the back of your property and doesn't get much human foot traffic, they're likely to feel safe there and they're much more likely to go nibble on those plants. Conversely, if you have a plant that's located up against your house or in an area that gets a lot of foot traffic, they're likely to avoid that area even if it's a plant that they typically find tasty. The second factor is your surrounding plants. If you have some tasty plants that are planted in the middle of a plot that has bergamot or mint or nodding onion around the edges, there's a really good chance that the deer are going to avoid that plot because they don't like the scent of those plants, especially when the leaves are crushed after they step on them. So if you're hoping to protect some prized plants that happen to also be tasty to deer, make sure you do your research and pick some strongly fragranced plants to go along the exterior of that bed in hopes of creating a natural boundary that the deer will want to avoid. Third is accessibility. If your plants are located along a grassy pathway that's easy for the deer to access, they're a lot more likely to be targeted by these hungry critters. If your plants are located along steep steps, a gravel pathway, or anything that's kind of inaccessible to those little deer hooves, then they're a lot less likely to be touched. And finally, seasonal pressure. In the spring, I'm on high alert for any fresh natives that I've planted that don't have a strong root structure. Why? Because deer love that tender spring growth that comes up first thing with the warm temperatures. I want to make sure I'm protecting new plants because once that fresh growth is bitten back, oftentimes that plant won't survive. Conversely, we tend to see some of our deer action pick up in the fall on some of our classically deer resistant plants. And the reason for that is simply because there's less available green plants for them to eat. Therefore, they need to target anything that's still producing fresh foliage. Fortunately, in the fall, I'm usually a lot less picky on what the deer eat. They've already gone through their bloom cycle, and I say go for it, enjoy your fall buffet. Now that we've talked about some of those factors that can impact how edible a plant is to a deer, let's walk around my yard and find a few examples of native plants that they've avoided versus native plants that they've enjoyed munching on. Our property is completely surrounded by woods, so we have really significant deer traffic around here. Let's take a look at some of my real-world examples of my own native plant plots, and I'll show you what the deer like to nibble on and what they completely avoid. I planted up this native plot last year. I did a tutorial video on that one as well, which I'll link up here and in the description below. This plot here is comprised of 13 different species of native plants. I did specifically select native plants that are known to be deer resistant, but as we learned earlier in the video, not all deer resistant plants will actually be avoided by the deer. In this front corner here, we have blue wild iris up front. We have our world milkweed to my right here. Just in front of me, I have a couple coreopsis plants, and to my right here, I have my nodding onion. All 4 of these varieties were completely left alone by the deer. I don't even see a single nibble on any of them, so these guys were truly deer resistant. Off to the other side of the front of my plot, I have my hoary vervain to my right here, butterfly milkweed to my left, I have a clethra bush also to my left, and off to the far side, I have my blue wild iris repeating again. In front of me here, you'll notice the remnants of 2 plants. These were actually my yellow coneflowers or my gray-headed coneflowers, and unfortunately the deer wiped them out. I have a little bit of foliage left on each plant, but outside of that, there's no way that these are going to bloom, and I'll be surprised if they even make it until next year. So it was a no-go on the gray-headed coneflower, but everything else fared out just fine. I did notice a little bit of nibbling happening on some of my butterfly milkweed that may or may not have been the deer, but either way, the damage was negligible and wasn't harmful to the plant overall. Working our way to the back of the plot, I have brown fox sedge along the edge. That again was not touched at all. My butterfly milkweed repeats again in the back, and I didn't notice any nibbles back here. However, in front of me here used to be a plot of New England aster, and they have pretty much mowed these completely to the ground. So this was apparently a tasty plant for them, and they really enjoyed it. I'm hopeful that these will come up again next year, but I'm not sure if I'm ever going to be able to get them to a point of being able to bloom. I may try a deer repellent spray or something along those lines on these plants, but other than that, I'm going to probably look for a deer resistant replacement to put in this area here. Behind me, I have a little bit of Joe Pieweed, and those again were eaten by the deer, not quite as prolifically as my New England aster or my gray-headed coneflower, but the deer did seem to like to nibble on those throughout the season, and I unfortunately wasn't able to get any of them to bloom. Behind me to my right here is the blazing star. Unfortunately, they didn't touch these guys at all. I'm really hopeful to get some blooms off of those next year because those are really stunning when they're in bloom. And lastly, I have my brown fox sedge that repeats one more time in this corner, and again, they didn't touch that in that location either. So a couple things to note: the plants that were eaten were actually in some of the least accessible locations. So right here in the middle, this is where my New England aster was located, and it's completely surrounded by plants that they determined weren't tasty enough to nibble. So limited accessibility unfortunately didn't benefit me in this situation, nor did it benefit me with my gray-headed coneflower. I did notice that the butterfly weed that was nibbled on was right towards the front of the plot and really easily accessible, so it kind of makes sense that they went in for a little taste up there. Moving on to another one of my native plots behind me. This one I did another tutorial on. This is a partial sun, partial shade plot, and behind me I have 5 different native plants. So let's talk about what the deer touched. Directly behind me, and quite tall as you can see, this is my sneezeweed. For the most part, sneezeweed is considered to be a deer resistant plant, and in this case it was deer resistant with the exception of this singular plant. For whatever reason, the deer decided that they wanted to taste this one. They didn't like it, so they didn't go for the rest of it, but just this singular plant did get a little bit of damage from the deer. Fortunately, he still bloomed for me this year, so I was excited to see that. Up front, I have my purple love grass, and the grass itself isn't doing well, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the deer. They did not touch that. Off to my right here, and already going into their seed phase, this is my lance leaf coreopsis. This guy was magnificent when he was in full bloom, and I'm really happy to announce that the deer did not touch my coreopsis at all. My last few plants that I have up here, I have purple prairie clover in the front quadrant here, and it did take these guys a while to bloom this year, but the deer did not touch them even when they came up as little seedlings, which in the past I have had a little bit of deer action on the really young seedling versions of these purple prairie clovers, so I was excited to see that they didn't have any interest in those this year. Off to my right, I have what is probably one of the only truly deer resistant plants in Michigan, and that is going to be my eastern southern prickly pear cactus. If you've ever worked with these before, you'll know it's so easy to get those spines stuck in your fingers. Deer have certainly experienced this. They have no interest in this plant whatsoever, and it will hurt if they ever decide to be curious about it. So of course, there was no action there. My wild lupine up here did not do very well overall. It likes a little bit more irrigation than what the rain had to offer for it, but the ones that did survive were not touched by the deer. I was very pleased to see that. And last but not least, I have a few fresh sprigs of wild bergamot that I actually planted this year in this plot. And of course, wild bergamot is very herby, very minty, and they had no interest even when they were seedlings. These dogwoods are actually a great example of why accessibility matters when it comes to deer-resistant plants. Dogwoods are normally not considered a deer-resistant plant at all. They're actually quite tasty, and the deer love to nibble on these guys. But these ones here have been able to reach their mature height without any issues, despite all the deer activity on this property, because of their location. These are located along stone steps that are difficult for the deer to walk on, and they're also relatively close to a house, which deer don't really like getting close to, even when they're used to human interaction. So these ones here, because of their placement, have been relatively unharmed over the years and reach heights of upwards of 9 feet tall, which is kind of crazy. Ninebarks are another shrub that deer classically enjoy, and unfortunately for these ninebarks, location is working against them because this area here is tucked against a wood line, and they feel very safe eating anything around this pavilion area. As you can see, this ninebark here to my right is suffering greatly and has seen better days. We will likely take him out and replace him with a different type of shrub because even with sprays and other methods of deterring the deer, they just go to town on this, and this has been a prime plant to eat from last season and this season. I'm surprised the shrub is hanging on at all, but we do need to relocate him closer to the house to try to get him to survive another year. Let's close this video out with a few tips for making your native landscaping as deer resistant as possible. First and foremost, mix your plantings. Try to mix up some truly deer resistant plants like bergamot or nodding onion with some non-deer resistant plants like your coneflower to deter deer from coming into your plot in the first place. Use that border method that I mentioned earlier with your stronger fragrance plants around the edges of your landscaping to create that natural border that hopefully deer will choose to avoid. Practice smart placement. Plant your more vulnerable plants closer to your house or closer to human foot traffic to deter deer from entering that area in the first place. Some of your more deer-resistant plants, like your coreopsis or your sneezeweed, can go further back on your property or along wood lines because they're a lot less likely to be targeted by the deer. Protect your young plants. New growth or fresh green growth that occurs in the spring is much more likely to be eaten and targeted by deer, regardless of what the species is. Oftentimes, this new growth doesn't taste nearly as strong as its mature counterpart, so even those plants with a strong fragrance or a bitter taste can still be targeted as fresh seedlings. Younger plants can't survive as much damage as mature plants can, so make sure that you're taking steps to protect these young plants. Deer spray like liquid fence or Bob-X can go a long ways, as well as a physical barrier. And lastly, plant in masses. If deer do choose to nibble on your plants, they're a lot more likely to survive if you have an entire grouping of them than if you're just dealing with an individual plant. In closing, very few plants are truly deer-proof, and a handful of them are deer-resistant under the right circumstances. Planting intelligently and using some of the tips that I mentioned today will help protect your native gardens for years to come. Just remember, if the deer do go after your native gardens, you did plant them for wildlife in the first place, so try not to get too discouraged. You created a yummy buffet for a critter in need. That's all I have for my video today. I hope that you found this video helpful, and I hope it helps you plan out your next native garden. If you're looking for more native landscaping advice, definitely subscribe to our channel and set up your alerts. We love talking about different landscape ideas and tips so that you can utilize native plants for a beautiful and functional garden. Thank you so much for tuning into this video today. It seriously helps out small businesses like ours so much. And as always, I sure hope to catch you next time. Bye-bye.